Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight as part of Dartmouth's multi-day, multi-event celebration of Martin Luther King Jr. I'm Joanne Blay, Program Officer at the Rockefeller Center. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that at any time during this presentation, you can ask your questions by navigating to the Q&A button. I also want to mention that Zoom now offers closed captioning. If you'd like to take advantage of this service, head down to the live transcript button. So sorry, live transcript button. Click on that and click on show subtitle. And if you don't see the live transcript button, if your screen is narrow, it may be under the more button. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Cheryl Bascomb, the Vice President for Alumni Relations at Dartmouth College. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you. I'm thrilled to be part of this session, and welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us this evening. We are honored to have such a tremendous scholar and authority on Dr. King joining us as our featured speaker. Dr. Clayborne Carson has devoted most of his professional life to the study of Martin Luther King Jr. and the movements King inspired. Since receiving his doctorate from UCLA in 1975, Dr. Carson has taught at Stanford University, where he is now Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor of History, Ronnie Lott Founding Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute, and a Senior Fellow at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. In 1985, the late Coretta Scott King invited Dr. Carson to direct a long-term project to edit and publish an authoritative version of King's speeches, sermons, correspondence, publications, and unpublished writings. Under Carson's direction, the King Papers Project has produced 7 volumes of the papers of Martin Luther King Jr., and they continue. In 2005, Carson founded the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute to endow and expand the work of the King Papers Project. Retired from classroom teaching, Carson now teaches a free online open enrollment course, American Prophet, the Inner Life and Global Vision of Martin Luther King Jr., and he produces a podcast, The World House. He's received 4 honorary degrees, including one from Morehouse College, the alma mater of Martin King Jr. and Sr. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Clayborne Carson.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. That's a short version of my introduction because I've had a long career, and I think during that career I've learned a lot about not only Martin Luther King but the movements, as you said, he inspired. And I think that one of the things that occurs to me every time we celebrate his birthday is how wonderful it would be if he were here as a 92-year-old, able to give us guidance in terms of the types of ways he would want his birthday to be celebrated. And I can't think of a better way than the title that has been put forward as, where do we go from here? It was the question he was asking at the end years of his life. And as also in the subtitle, it's still his unanswered question. And I think that he would still be looking for definitive answers. And I think there's a lot of similarities between our current period and the last years of his life, because there again was another period of great hope and promise. When you think back to Martin Luther King during the mid-1960s, he was achieving his greatest victories. The passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and that whole collection of reforms that we now recall as the Great Society programs of President Lyndon Johnson. So there was a lot of hope during that time, but by the time he wrote the book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, he was also feeling some despair, because it did seem as if even in this moment of hope, there was a lot of cause for despair because the nation was deeply divided then as it is now. So I think that if he came back, he would recognize that in some ways we're at a similar point in our history. That just last spring and summer we saw this upsurge of activism to the point that it exceeded anything that happened in the 1960s. I went to the March on Washington and was so amazed to see 200,000 people gathered there. I'd never seen so many people in my life gathered, and there hadn't been any kind of protests on that scale. But just last spring, within days of the murder of George Floyd, young people, mostly, brought together protests on a scale so much larger than the March on Washington. And there was that sense, because these protests, like the march, included people who were not Black, it did seem to give promise, give many people hope that some of the deep-rooted problems that persisted after the 1960s could be addressed. And I think that in the same way Martin Luther King expected after the passage of this wonderful legislation during the mid-1960s, that again, the nation would address these longstanding problems. But even as he was writing that book, he was recognizing that the nation was turning away from those reforms, that there was a white backlash against Black militancy, that there was a Southern strategy that was going to dominate American politics for the next half century, in which tens of millions of white voters who had voted for Lyndon Johnson in 1964, that became the last election in which the majority of white Americans voted for a Democrat. Tens of millions went over to the Republican Party of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. And that division, I think, if anything, has persisted and even become more prominent in American politics in the years since. So that the same year in which we saw protests on an unprecedented scale, we also saw an election in which, yes, Joe Biden won, but Donald Trump received more votes than any other presidential candidate, with the exception of Joe Biden. So we can see that this nation is, like it was in the mid-1960s, very much divided. And that progress that was the promise of the mid-1960s became stalled. So he wrote that book as a pressing question, where do we go from here? And the here in that question, we want to kind of take that question apart and say, where is here for him? And it was after the passage of civil rights legislation, but he had already moved to address other issues such as poverty, the persistence of war, the ways in which racial conflict was not the same as the Jim Crow system, but we still had a very segregated society. So those questions that he was asking then, I think, are still pressing now. And as indicated in the title, you've kind of taken my conclusion and said it's still an unanswered question. And I think part of the reason why it's an unanswered question is that we have to look at it very closely and say, who is the we in that question? Where do we go from here? How are we going to decide? Who are we going to move forward with to build a better society and a better world? That question was evident then. It's still evident now. And until we decide who we are as Americans, it's very difficult to address the first word in that question, where. I think you have to decide the who before we get to the question of where are we going. We have to begin to decide who we are as Americans, and to be very blunt about it, we are two different Americas, at least, perhaps maybe even many Americas. So I think there's a reason why that question has gone unanswered for 50 years. It's difficult. It's difficult to find a definitive answer. I think one of the things that really provides an understanding of this division is that younger people in general have grown up in a very different world than their elders. The kind of world that shaped the politics of the 1960s is not the same world that shapes American politics now. I mentioned that that Donald Trump received more votes than any other presidential candidate, and that's almost half of America. The margin of victory was very small in percentage terms. And I think we also see that the Black Lives Matter protests were, I think, stimulated and for the most part organized by people in their teens and then their 20s. It's interesting to speculate, for example, that whether if only people over 30 had decided how to respond to the murder of George Floyd last spring, would we have seen protests on that scale? I actually think not. I think that one of the divisions is by age. And I think for many older Americans, and I put myself in that category, looked at that and said, yes, that was terrible, but we've seen it before. And I think it took young eyes to look at that terrible event and say, yes, it might have happened before, but not when I'm watching it. And I have to do something about it. I have to protest against it. I have to build a better society than that. So I think that's where we are in terms of trying to answer that question. I think for young people, the answer to the question is we are not really that different a society than we were in the mid-1960s. We still have these great divisions over questions of race. But the difference is that there's more optimism, there's more hope that perhaps we can create something different. Perhaps we can agree that we, as Americans, can go to a better, not only a nation, but toward a better world. I think there are some differences in terms of the perspective of a young person who has grown up in a different kind of America. First of all, one of the things that I think is hopeful is that they've grown up in America after the Cold War, where the kind of division over the questions of the Cold War are not as salient today as they once were. Martin Luther King, as some of you know, was investigated by the FBI and hounded, in part because of questions of where does he stand on the Cold War, and his opposition to the war in Vietnam was a large part of the decline in his popularity by the time he wrote Where Do We Go From Here? So I think that for young people who have grown up after the Cold War, they're able to look at American politics quite differently than their parents and grandparents, without making the issues of the Cold War dominant issues within American politics. And I see that in terms of questions about socialism. You know, in the mid-1960s, an issue like Medicare for all you had to do was mention that, well, that's socialistic, we can't have that in the United States. And I think for many young people, there's less of a tendency to put American politics in Cold War terms, so that even in the Georgia election, I saw that the opponent of one of the senatorial candidates use that Cold War rhetoric. What he's calling for is communistic, socialistic, and equating the two. So I think that that's a sign. And I think also young people have grown up with the awareness we've had a Black president. That in itself is a hopeful sign, although I would also add that having a Black president also generated an opposition to that idea. And I think the election of Barack Obama in 2008 prepared the way for the election of Donald Trump in 2016. So where does this leave us? How are we going to address King's question? How are we going to find an answer to it? And as I said, I think it takes those three crucial words. Who are we? How do we define that? And where are we going? And also just defining where we are today and recognizing that in this divided nation, we need to find a new way of defining the issues, bringing about a majority at least who are in favor of a progressive direction in American politics. And I think that that's beginning to happen. I'm optimistic. One of the things that I was thinking about in terms of reflecting over the events of the last 2 months is I remember reading Charles Dickens and Tale of Two Cities, and it was the best of all times, the worst of all times. And during times of rapid change, it is both. The rapid change brings hope. It also brings despair. It generates a movements for change and also movements to resist change. So I think that that's the point we are in this nation. Can we answer that question? Where do we go from here? Again, I would suggest that we really can't answer that question until we decide who are we as Americans and what kind of America we want to build. So I'm really prefer to spend my time with you answering questions rather than finding out how you are going to answer that question, rather than lecturing you about what I think is the answer to that question. So, but clearly, I think if Martin Luther King were here, he would suggest the answer to that question has to be a global answer. It's not simply a matter of who are we as Americans, but who are we in the world. It's one of the reasons why I've built a new project that is now at the center of my work. It's called the World House Project. And in it, I take seriously King's metaphor that we've inherited a world house. It's called the Earth. We have to live in it. We have to live in it with people of different faiths, different perspectives, different ideas, different cultures. And he also posed some very daunting possibilities, because the subtitle to that book was Chaos or Community. During the past year, I think we've seen signs of chaos, especially just recently, but we've also seen signs of new community. That's the hope. The other is the fear of change. Clearly, America is going to be a different place, and it's up to us to decide what kind of place it will be. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions that you might have. I'm sure in terms of questions, you could also provide answers to King's questions. But in any case, I will end my talk right now and just finding out what you're curious about. And please feel free to ask me anything you want.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carson. It's wonderful perspective and a good reminder of why you've titled your podcast as you have, and that we live on this earth and we live in this world, and we have to figure out how to live with others who aren't like us in many ways. I would encourage all of you who have questions for Dr. Carson. This is an incredible resource we have here, so please ask. Put them in the Q&A widget below, and we will get as many as we can to Dr. Carson in the time that we have remaining together. We do have some questions that we got in advance that came in from students, and I'd like to ask a couple of them to get us started. So the first one I have is, in Dr. King's A Letter from Birmingham Jail, he fiercely condemned the white moderate. Who exactly was he talking about, and how would his belief on this reflect in today's culture?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because we're working on volume 8 of the King Papers as we speak, and the letter from Birmingham Jail is one of the documents that'll be in that. So obviously I've had a lot of time to think about that letter and what stimulated it. It was white clergy in Birmingham who were concerned about the protests that were going on, the protest campaign, and basically said that the Birmingham campaign was unwise and untimely. And they presented themselves as people who favored racial reform in Birmingham. But they were saying that that this was going too fast. And so the essence of King's letter was, that's always going to be the answer of people who are resistant to change and basically want change to be slower. And so in the 1960s, these changes that I referred to before, the passage of new legislation, desegregation, all of these things generated their own opposition. And in this case, King was addressing people who were saying, go slower, wait, change will come. And he's saying that the bending of the moral arc of the universe doesn't happen automatically. Someone has to bend it. And without someone to actively bend that moral arc, it can be bent in the other way. Change does not happen in just simply one direction. We have change and reaction, and sometimes the moral arc is bent away from justice. So I think it was a very profound notion that you have to bend the arc. It doesn't bend by itself. There is that sense that some people have about that quote about the moral arc of the universe bends toward, that's automatic, and it's not automatic. It takes conscious action to make that happen. And we have had periods that go on for an entire era in which injustice seems to be prevailing over justice. So I think that it's something we have to remember, that the change is always, the world is always changing. The question is what direction.
Wonderful, thank you. It's a great point. Gravity isn't going to do it for the bending toward justice.
Yeah, I like to make the phrase bending the arc, the moral arc of the universe.
Yeah,
Because that is what has to happen.
Mm-hmm. And we have to play a role. I love that. One of the other questions that came in from our students was, a word that has been in the minds of many in this country over the past several years has been division. How does today's division compared to that of Dr. King's time, and according to Dr. King's writings, what can we perhaps learn about the causes, effects, and possible remedies in today's division?
I think you're always going to have some kind of division. I think that what is troubling is when division is rooted in deep-seated, for example, racial attitudes. And that's what I was getting into in the reference to the Southern strategy, that there was a conscious effort on the part of people like Richard Nixon, Spiro Agnew, and others who were the architects of the Southern strategy. And what it was we got, as a political party, beaten badly in the 1964 election. How do we regain power? And the answer was, well, you somewhat cautiously, somewhat subtly play on the racial fears of Americans. And you use that as your means of acquiring power. And that turned out to be a very, very effective strategy. I would argue that that strategy is still around today, that playing on racial fears is a very effective way of gaining votes and turning people against their own self-interest. You know, why do, and King addressed this when in many of his speeches, he asked the question, why do poor whites vote against programs like the Great Society programs that are designed to help poor whites? That there are far more poor white people in the United States than poor Black people. Why aren't they in favor of the war on poverty? Well, part of it is they still had their white privilege. And he said that for many people, that substitutes for economic gain. And because no matter how poor you are, you're still white. And that has advantages in American society. So I think that part of the reason why we have this is that the attitudes of the past linger on even after the world begins to change against that previous world. And those people who had been the beneficiaries of privilege in the world are not eager to give it up, even if they understand on some level that those privileges might have been based on racial prejudices and other kinds of prejudices, but still, those are privileges. And so I think that that's going to be one of the causes. Any movement generates its own opposition. There are always going to be people who, simply because they're afraid of rapid change, but sometimes they're even most afraid of change that's going to undermine some of the privileges they have.
Thank you. That is something I think we're seeing today clearly. One question from the audience. We're getting quite a few. Thank you. Keep them coming. One big difference between the 60s and now is the broad expansion of media and social media. How do you suggest that we move forward from the massive amounts of misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies that seem to be prevalent in what we call media?
Yes, I think a lot of people are thinking about that, of how, I lived for many years in Silicon Valley. And I remember all that optimistic writings. People were saying that, oh, this new age in which the world will be connected through technology is going to be a much better world. And that people will be able to understand each other because they're able to communicate more easily with one another. Every week I can have a Zoom call with people in all parts of the world, and that can bring us together. But technology is neutral. It doesn't have morality. Only the morality is expressed in terms of how people use technology. And you can also use that very same technology to divide people. And we've seen so many signs of that, of how technology can be used to spread, as you point out, lies, um, untruths. It can make people suspicious of others. Um, it can make people behave in ways that they might not behave in terms of direct contact with other people. You can assume personalities on the web that are not really you. And that in that way, I think technology can be a very dangerous tool. So I think we maybe had a naive sense back 20 years ago that Facebook and Twitter and all of these tools would bring the world together, but technology is never going to do that automatically. It is kind of like the moral arc. It has to be bent. It has to be, technology is to be used, and the motives of the people using it are what matter. So I think that it's not, to me, not very much of a surprise that now we're having this controversy over technology. That was always the case. Technology is an instrument of war, but it's also an instrument of medicine and healing. It depends on how people want to use the technology.
Excellent point. And there are more channels now than ever before for people to be choosing from in terms of what they learn.
And that's very helpful in the sense that, when you think back to the 1960s, there were 3 television networks. There were, a lot of the news came through the Associated Press or United Press. There was one news agency in the United States. So most people got their news filtered through those small outlets, and that had its own problems. So I think that one thing that movements do is they search out other channels of communication. That's what allowed Black Lives Matter to spread so quickly, was using technology very wisely. So there's nothing wrong with technology. If we didn't have technology, all of us would still be out in the fields with a plow. Instead, we drive around in cars and we watch television and do lots of other things that were just impossible without technology.
Right.
So we can't live with meetings. Right. Yes.
Terrific. Well, following that, we have a similar question about how can we counter these disinformation efforts?
I think the major thing is I think everyone has to come to a conclusion about how they feel about sources of verified information. Those of us who go to college and learn, hopefully begin to distinguish between what is verifiable. We, even in high school, we learned something about the scientific method, that truths are not with a capital T, they're with a small t, that have to be tested, they have to be verified. And yet it's so easy to forget that. We could talk about religion, for example. I mean, there is a part of religion that's just based around faith. And those kinds of attitudes are often the most difficult to change. But one of the ways in which religion has changed over time is literacy. That there was a time when only the minister or the priest knew how to read the Bible. And I think the world advanced and became more democratic when ordinary people could learn to read, and they could interpret the Bible on their own and say, no, it doesn't mean that. But here are the words and I can interpret them myself. And that changed the world. That democratization of religion was one of the basic forces that led to the development of a more democratic society, and that couldn't be dominated by elites because everybody could get information. But it starts with the ability to discern what are lies and how to verify what is not truth with a capital T, as I said. There's that ultimate truth, but at least truth that can be verified. And we see this in the argument over, COVID. At least in the scientific world, you can disprove something. There are rules about how to verify, and you have people who are always skeptical, which I think is good. Anything that you're not skeptical about, I think, is a very dangerous idea. So I think that that's part of it, is that we have to make that, and I think also often we get, and this has been pointed out, we get into our silos where we only talk to people who agree with us. We don't get our ideas challenged, and that's true of some people on the left as well as some people on the right. That you get in a, say, Facebook conversations with only people who basically agree with you. And I think that building that we that I was talking about before, what that does is it tends to build two categories of we. The people who believe one idea versus the people who believe in this other idea. And you don't have very much dialogue between them. And you don't have a way of testing the validity of your ideas. So I think that that's at the heart of building a better world, is that we have to have that degree of skepticism about what is true, what is untrue. And we also have to reach out and talk with people who have different viewpoints and get out of that comfort zone. It's one of the things that I think college at its best does, is it introduces you to people who have different ideas and with ways of arguing about ideas in a respectful way. So so that, why else would we go to college? If we all had all the knowledge we need by the time we get there, why bother? Why bother to go to classes? Unless you want to develop your ability to make those kinds of judgments.
Excellent point. Important dialogue to lean into if we can. We have another question that says, you mentioned the Obama presidency elicited some racist backlash. What, if anything, could President Obama have done to mitigate the backlash? And what can Joe Biden and Kamala Harris do to avoid the same?
Don't I wish I had the ear of both of them in terms of trying to advise. And it is difficult. I think that there's a desire to do that. I think every president goes in wanting to believe, yes, I may have won by a narrow margin, but I would like to build a larger majority. So I think they all go in with that idea. Trying to do it is sometimes hard, because you have to broaden your coalition. You have to have a way of reaching people. And I think one of the unfortunate aspects is that every president has two choices. Do you try to build the people who, expand the group that elected you? That's mobilize those and make sure they get to the polls, or do you try to reach out to those who voted against you, which is a much harder process? And I think it's not surprising that ultimately the easier choice is, well, trying to convince somebody who voted against me is harder than trying to convince someone who voted for me to go and vote. So I'm going to concentrate on that activity and put my resources into that. And that's a reasonable choice. But I think in the long term, I would hope that through his programs, not so much through rhetoric. I think when people discover that a president is producing programs that benefit them, and over a long term, then the dialogue becomes easier. As I said, one of the things that I would emphasize is things like making higher education more accessible, making medical care more accessible. Those are kind of concrete things that can benefit people, and then the dialogue over them becomes a bit easier. That they can see that they are gaining something, and that's important and lasting. So, and I think ultimately that's the way the society gets. Every new program to help people is controversial when it starts. There was a time when there weren't even protections against child labor. That was controversial, and presidents early in the 20th century had to work to pass laws against, um, children 13 years old working in factories. And that was seen as, that's not the business of government. But gradually people understood that, those policies are very helpful. For one, it stops the exploitation of kids. And you see at every stage, that something like Social Security, that was extremely controversial. Medicare, all of these programs. But ultimately, once people get used to them, there's a sense that, oh, well, why was there all that fight over it? And that's what I would hope at some point. I think, once we get used to the idea that you don't have to have young people running up massive debt to go to college and starting out their adult lives with debt hanging over their heads. Once people get used to that, then they would wonder, like, why did we put up with that for so long? Why wasn't that reform implemented even earlier? I've seen in California, for example, the reverse of that is that when I went to UCLA and worked my way through school, because the fees, there was no tuition, by the way, but the fees were about $100 a semester. Now, to go to UCLA, it's many, many times that much, maybe 100 times that much. And it's frightening how much that cost has escalated. And so I think that we need to fight for concrete things that help people. I think that the political system kind of breaks down when it's over more symbolic issues. And I think one of the things that usually happens is that once you make a gain, once you get used to people get used to having Medicare, they wonder, well, didn't they always have a medical care program for people over 65? And it's hard to even imagine that time, but that was the case. So I think the major thing is just to do concrete good things to make life more livable and fair for everyone, and hopefully that will distract us from, kind of more emotional issues of change. It doesn't get rid of those other issues, issues of identity, things like that, where you're you're um, you're arguing over, say, religious values. Those are much more intractable, and it's so I think that's probably what Biden will focus on, is try to do concrete things that will not get us back into this either or issues where you can't resolve it without one group feeling betrayed.
Good advice. Thank you. We have a question about Dr. King, and how would he approach those who are so resistant to change?
I think, first of all, he would know how difficult it is. When you think about it, Martin Luther King, definitely when he was alive or late in his life, his popularity was at a low point, because as people discovered that he was not simply a civil rights leader, he was a human rights leader. And so when he began to talk about things like fighting to eliminate poverty, that these were very controversial. And I think he understood that he was not after popularity. I think he was willing to say, yes, this is taking a stand on the Vietnam War is going to be very unpopular. But my job as a moral leader is to decide what I think is the right course, regardless of its consequences. And I think, again, just to compare that with other political leaders, I think there are times when any political leader has to say, I'm going to take this stand because I think it's right. It might cost me some popularity, but I'm going to do it because I strongly believe it's right. I think to some degree, the issue of immigration is going to, it's a divisive issue, but I think there is right and wrong, and I strongly believe that human rights don't stop at borders, that we often have this sense that human rights are the same as civil rights. No, they're not. Civil rights are those rights that governments want to protect and are willing to protect. And really, our civil rights are basically our passport. It determines how we're treated in the world. And there is something unjust about a world where, as an American citizen, I can and have gone to practically any country in the world and be welcomed, while a poor person with what I would call a poor person's passport from a poor country, the world is quite different. No one wants you. You can't go there. So the same kind of freedoms that led tens of millions of Europeans to come to the United States for opportunity, many of them poor as anyone from Central America. They came in without visas, and they were often not welcomed, but they were able to get into America, and they built industrial America. Italians and Eastern Europeans and many other groups who came into the society. Now, one of the ironies of it is that some of those same people, their descendants, closed the door behind them and passed the anti-immigration laws of the 1920s and the years since, so that now you can't enter the same way they did. by just getting on a ship and getting off at Ellis Island, and if you didn't have tuberculosis or something like that, and if you were white, because that open door was not available to people who are not white. So I think we have to really start thinking in human rights terms in our century.
Excellent distinction. Thank you. That is helpful for us to remember the history of that. We have another question about whether James Baldwin influenced Dr. King, and if he did, how did he?
I would say not too much, but James Baldwin knew Martin Luther King and wrote about him. He wrote an article that received a lot of attention when he interviewed King, and he wrote this article called "The Dangerous Road in Front of Martin Luther King." And why was it dangerous? Because Martin Luther King was trying to push hard for change, but also try to keep Black Americans within that nonviolent, the world of nonviolence. And he said that, you know, Martin Luther King is stimulating a desire not for freedom someday, but freedom now. And as a leader, he can't deliver freedom now. And that's why his road is dangerous, because other leaders are going to come along and say, Martin Luther King is too cautious, too conservative. And sure enough, the Black Power movement of the late 1960s was basically a response to Martin Luther King and saying, we're not going to wait. You know, we're not patient anymore. And Martin Luther King tried to understand that. He tried to understand that that's part of what that book, Where Do We Go From Here, is about, his response to the Black Power movement. And he said, you know, yes, I agree with you. Change should come, but it has to come nonviolently. It has to come with allies. And I agree with you that Black people need to express pride in being Black, and they need to organize and build in Black controlled institutions. But that should be done in a way that is not destructive. And, you know, so that was part of his argument with Stokely Carmichael, who was a person I knew quite well during the 60s. As, you know, Stokely Carmichael was saying, why should we wait? Why should we wait for our rights? And Stokely Carmichael on his side he was also aware that young Black men, such as myself, were being drafted to go to Vietnam to fight for democracy there. So why didn't we fight for democracy in Mississippi and Alabama? And, you know, so there was that contradiction, and I think that that's one of the reasons why the movement divided during the late 1960s, is that, and every group that wants to liberate itself, you know, were women patient about getting their rights as women? Were gay people patient about getting their rights? Of course not. You know, that's a very hard thing to do, of saying, I know I have a right to be treated in a certain way, but, you know, if it takes a long time, I'm patient. Not many of us have that kind of patience. So part of the problem with any social movement is that it wants to go fast, but it knows that by going fast, it's going to frighten people who are not willing to accept the rapid pace of change. And that's always going to be a conflict. You know, when you get involved in a social movement, you know, you want the change to be, we want it now.
It's fascinating that when you opened and talked about how people over 30 would respond today versus how young
Yes,
people responded. It's consistent with that.
yes, definitely.
We
Yeah,
have
and you just wonder why, back in Martin Luther King's day, if if I, when I were 20 years old, would think that a half a century later, we would still be dealing with something like police brutality and how to stop it, and that this would be an issue going into the 21st century. In fact, in some ways, even more serious issue. So, so I think that's another thing that King would be surprised by, is that how many issues, how many, now in Birmingham, Alabama, he was dealing with police brutality in 1963. You probably have just as much brutal treatment of innocent people now as you had back then.
Mm.
Why haven't we dealt with that problem?
And still dealing. Yes. And one last question. We are running out of time. This has been fascinating. I've lost track of time, so I apologize. It's a couple minutes to go. One thing somebody asked that's a little different is, what was the most surprising thing you discovered in Dr. King's archives?
Oh my gosh. So many things, just every year we come up with new things to learn about him. I think the major thing I discovered, and it's not that surprising, I didn't discover her, but Coretta, the role of Coretta King in Martin Luther King's life and in her own life. I worked with Coretta King for about 2 decades as editor of the papers. And I think that forced me to kind of try to figure out, like, who is this woman? What role did she play? And one of the things that was very surprising was that she was an activist before he was. She was older, and she was more politically active and more politically radical than he was when they met. She was a delegate to the Progressive Party convention, the third, this leftist third party of the 1940s. She was there at their annual convention. She knew people who were being attacked as too leftists, and even attacked as being communists. Like W.E.B. Du Bois or Paul Robeson. These tremendous Black leaders of that time were also very controversial leaders because they were opposed to the Cold War. And so she knew these people. She knew Bayard Rustin, who was one of, long before Martin knew him. And so I found it fascinating to look at her life and the decision that she made. She had a career of her own. She was wanted to be a singer, and she was like him in graduate school. And but part of her decision during the 1950s, and it's a decision that many well-educated Black women and white women made, and that is deferring to the man she loved and saying, your career should take precedent. I will agree to stay home, take care of the kids, raise the family. And that was frustrating for her. And it's an interesting story because she was always trying to say, can't I do both? Can't I be a mother and also be an activist? And I'm found out that she was just behind the scenes. She took a strong stand against the Vietnam War years before Martin did. She was a member of a group called the Women's International Strike for Peace during the 1950s. and actually went to a international meeting of the group in Geneva in 1962. She was part of the first Women's March in Washington. So Coretta King, her story has not really, she's written a couple of memoirs, and some of that story, but some of it she admits that she admitted that part of the reason why she didn't tell that story is that she didn't want controversy about her political activity to interfere with Martin's life. So it was only later in her life that she was more willing to talk candidly about that. How she was closely related with people who were quite controversial for their politics of that time. So that's certainly an area that probably going into it, I did not realize the extent of her own political activity.
Well, that is fascinating and surprising, but it does show you how successful she was at supporting Dr. King's positions and primacy there. So thank you so much, Dr. Carson. We are grateful for your insights, for the time you've taken, and really for the inspiration and the opportunity for us to think more about this question. So we appreciate it. And to you, our audience, thank you for your time and your attention, and hopefully to your renewed focus on Dr. King's question, where do we go from here? There are other programs that will help you consider joining in celebration of Dr. King, and they include a multi-faith celebration and service hosted by the Tucker Center, and that's Sunday, January 24th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And the featured speaker is Dr. Tricia Rose. We'll have diverse student voices and music by the Dartmouth Gospel Choir, and it's all followed by a live interactive discussion with Dr. Rose. So we hope you'll find something this week that you want to do to join us. But I'd like you to join me in thanking Dr. Carson for his time and wonderful insights.
It's been good being with you.
Thank you, Cheryl. You were a terrific host. You can be sure that we're going to call on you again for that. Dr. Carson, thank you. We are truly fortunate to celebrate Martin Luther King's birthday with you. We know you had an incredibly busy weekend with your seminar this past weekend, so we are especially grateful that you were able to join us tonight. And I just want to close out by reminding everybody that the Rockefeller Center is hosting another event Thursday night, day after tomorrow. We will be hosting Middlebury College Professor Matthew Dickinson and Dartmouth College Professor Emerita Linda Fowler in a discussion entitled, "Did the System Work? The Fragile State of American Political Institutions." And that event will be hosted by Jason Barabas, the director of the Rockefeller Center. We hope to see you again Thursday night. Thank you to everyone for taking part tonight.